And hello, everybody. As a doctor who used to be a journalist, words have always fascinated me. I love their beauty and I'm intrigued by their power, that with nothing but words you can conjure a whole imagined world, or you can inspire a set of emotions in your reader, or you can seduce us, persuade us into believing things that aren't necessarily true. But I think if we ask ourselves how doctors fundamentally heal, we wouldn't necessarily answer in the 21st century through the medium of words. Modern medicine is high tech, it's full of scans and genomics and molecular analyses. But I believe fundamentally that journalism and medicine share the same core, the same bedrock, and it is that of words, in particular storytelling. It's absolutely at the essence of both of those professions. So as a documentary maker, I used to tell other people's stories for a living, and now as a doctor, my job is to listen to my patients very carefully, very attentively, and hear their stories and try, with the help of my team, to shape those stories for the better. I imagine that most of you will, or some of you anyway, may recognise this man sporting an absolutely resplendent example of facial hair. This is Sir William Osler, a 19th century professor who is widely regarded as the father of modern medicine, and he is famous for recognising the unique importance of storytelling in medicine. He always used to urge his medical students and his doctors in training to go to the bedside, to go and see and talk to their patients, and he said once, just listen to the patient. He is telling you his diagnosis. That view of medicine is every bit as much true today as it was back then. Even in high-tech 21st century medicine, it is invariably the case that simply by sitting down and having a discussion with a patient, you can work out the diagnosis, you can figure out what's wrong with them. So that's one way in which words are important, matter to us as doctors. There's another more fundamental sense in which they matter, which is encapsulated beautifully in this quote by the author Philip Pullman, who isn't bad at storytelling himself. So he said, after nourishment, shelter, and companionship, stories are the thing we need most in the world. I think that gets at something absolutely fundamental and essential about being human, and I think that is nowhere more true than in a hospital where patients are vulnerable, disempowered, frightened, alone, and where what heals in that environment isn't only a doctor's drugs or our scalpels, it's smaller things too that matter. It is us as clinicians holding someone, hearing them, making sure they know that they are being heard and held. We need to treat our patients in such a way that the narrative they can tell themselves is one of caring. They can trust us because we use words, one of the most important tools at our disposal, to instill a relationship of trust in and with our patients. That's why words matter. It's fair to say that we're all familiar with words being dear to our political representatives as well, and here is a famous politician, Winston Churchill. Politicians, as we know, use words to try and win over the trust of us, the electorate. Some might say they misuse words as well. We're very familiar in 2018 with the concept of fake news and the abuse of words in order to spin a narrative, a political narrative. This is the week in which Gary Oldman won a richly deserved Oscar for his role playing Winston Churchill in the wonderful film Darkest Hour. And if anyone in the audience hasn't seen Darkest Hour, I urge you, immediately, or as soon as my talk is over, to go out and see this film. Sorry, rest of the contributors. It is a tremendous film. It is about, it's a masterclass really about political rhetoric, the way in which Winston Churchill used his formidable powers of rhetoric and oration to win over the House of Commons and persuade both sides of the House to abandon Neville Chamberlain's policy of appeasement towards Hitler and instead declare war on Germany. The end of the film is I'm not giving away the plot because I think we know how it ends. It's a tremendous scene where Churchill gives one of his extraordinary speeches and the entire House, both sides, erupts in cheers and applause. And two of Neville Chamberlain's great supporters, two MPs, are sitting together, and one turns to the other, completely baffled and nonplussed, and says, "What just happened there?" And his fellow MP turns to him and says this: "He mobilised the English language and sent it into battle." So in 2015, another British politician went to war using words. And in his case, he wasn't fighting Nazi Germany, he was fighting doctors like me, NHS junior doctors. This is, of course, Jeremy Hunt, and in 2015, he gave a speech in which he declared he was going to take on the medical profession. It was reported in the newspapers in these very aggressive terms, and it did indeed feel like an assault upon the medical profession. Mr. Hunt made a quite extraordinary claim that 11,000 people a year were dying unnecessarily at weekends in our hospitals because hospitals were understaffed at weekends. And the reason they were understaffed was because we, doctors in the NHS, were essentially too selfish and financially grasping to work at weekends unless we were paid lucrative overtime rates. This story erupted. It was on the front page of every newspaper. These are examples of headlines. So that headline is from the Daily Mail. This is a more extreme example from the Sunday Express, where explicitly you can see Jeremy Hunt there blaming doctors, our love of overtime rates at weekends, directly for 11,000 avoidable deaths a year. I can't overestimate how traumatic it was at this time to suddenly receive this degree of attack, really, and smearing from the government, when I don't know a single NHS doctor who ever went into medicine to make a lot of money. They'd have to be barking mad if that was their route to do it. There's a lot of bodily fluid. There isn't so much of the megabucks in the NHS. We all went into it, of course, because we wanted to help people. We cared. We loved looking after patients. And actually, most of us tended to work 1 in 3, 1 in 4 weekends anyway. So it was a very distressing time. And interestingly, needless to say, the words Mr. Hunt used were not strictly accurate. So this is a screenshot from the UK fact-checking website. It's an independent, highly regarded charity. They look into the claims politicians make, and in this case there was absolutely no evidence for Jeremy Hunt's claim that understaffing was leading to these avoidable deaths. The reason we entered into a dispute with the government, that we didn't take this lying down and instead pursued a traumatic strategy that resulted in strikes, in junior doctors in their thousands up and down the country going on strike, wasn't so much for ourselves, although I'm sure the government would say otherwise. It was because we were genuinely horrified by the government's proposed solution to this problem that they had to some degree fabricated in words. They proposed a 7-day NHS, that somehow they were going to be the saviour of patients at weekends by delivering a new set of services at weekends which would make them as safe as Monday to Friday. There was just one fly in the ointment. This was a brilliant soundbite. It was just about the most persuasive phrase you could ever write in a Conservative Party manifesto about the NHS. but it wasn't backed up by a single pound of extra funding, a single extra doctor, a single extra nurse. There were no more staff to allegedly create these safer and better weekend services. That was our problem. This was a dishonesty being writ large upon the electorate. And it was a particularly traumatic dishonesty because, as I suspect you're well aware, it's constantly on the front pages of the newspapers in the UK. The NHS is terribly understaffed at the moment. We are short of 100,000 staff in the NHS right now, 100,000 missing gaps in all of the clinical rotas. There are 40,000 too few nurses, 10,000 too few doctors. It means we're routinely working 2 doctors' jobs. You're on call, you get given 2 bleeps instead of 1 bleep. You're running around looking after twice as many patients. It's dangerous and it's soul-destroying. We went on strike because we couldn't bear the thought of being stretched any more thinly than we were already. Not only is it dangerous, it risks crushing the very thing that drove us into medicine in the first place, our desire to care. You can't maintain your compassion and your caring and your kindness towards patients, all the things that make your relationship therapeutic with patients, if you're running around like a blue-arsed fly. You just can't do it. You end up becoming hardened and callous or depressed, or you quit and you lose your caring. It's appalling. And this is what's happening now in many hospitals. This quote by the poet, wonderful poet Maya Angelou, really strikes a chord with me. I've learned that people will forget what you've said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. I never, ever want to work as a doctor in such a way that my patients do not feel that I care for them. And right now, that's the situation that many, many doctors in Britain and nurses are enduring. And it's very hard to do if by nature you want to care for people. So we didn't take this lying down, it's fair to say. We felt as though we were really campaigning for the essence of our profession. We went on strike, we took to the airwaves, the television and radio studios, we spoke out. And being a former journalist, I had an understanding of the way in which political spin worked, and I was able to really put myself out there and try and explain why we were so opposed to the government's plans for imposing a new contract upon us. There was one thing that particularly irritated me about Jeremy Hunt. There were many, it's fair to be said, but this in particular was distressing. It was his door. So Jeremy loved to say in every interview, everything he wrote for the newspapers, that his door was always open to junior doctors. We were the backbone of the NHS. We were tremendous, and he really cared about us. Please come and talk to him. At the same time, he also took scrupulous care never ever to be seen in public with a single junior doctor. Funny that, I can't think why. He once was filmed by Sky News literally running up a corridor and up a flight of stairs to escape a junior doctor, a friend of mine, who pursued him heroically saying, "Mr. Hunt, I'd like to ask you a question." That's how open his door was. In fact, it seemed to me as though in the entire history of human entrances and exits, no open door had ever been so resolutely slammed shut as Mr. Hunt's was to us. So I thought I would take him up on that. And I planned a little piece of direct action. At the tender age of 43, a mother with 2 young children, I decided to sleep rough outside the Department of Health in London for 24 hours to start a campaign of peaceful protest to try and propel Mr. Hunt to open that door of his and get back around the negotiating table with junior doctors. And it started with this little film.
And he's going to be there?
It's less than 2 weeks till the next strike. He's got to be in London. He's got to be in his office trying to fix this.
You've got to hope he's trying to do something to stop the strikes, and that's what we're here to do as well. We've got to talk.
I'm sorry to bother you. We're both junior doctors, and we've come here today because we would very much like to talk to the Secretary of State, Jeremy Hunt.
My name's Dagan, this is Rachel, we're junior doctors.
He's told us many, many times that his door is always open to junior doctors, and we need to speak to him.
What you could possibly do is let the Health Secretary know that we'll wait for him for the whole day and the whole night.
If he has even a few minutes to talk to us, we'd be very, very grateful.
Definitely. And there will be doctors here every day from now until a time he sees fit to speak to us. We're told that Jeremy may not be in the building, but that they're going to get a message to him. And we hope the British public will see that junior doctors are desperate to avoid further strike action.
The message is really, really simple. It is time to talk. There has never been a more important time to talk. And there are 54,000 junior doctors who want to talk to him, and we will be here in shifts for as long as it takes. It's time to talk. This is very, very shallow, but I can't tell you how pleasing this was. We learned from a security guard inside the Department of Health, who was assigned to be our minder, that when this happened, the whole department went into meltdown and the press office were panicking, and apparently in those big tall windows you can see above us, Jeremy Hunt stood with his arms folded for half an hour just glowering at us, unseen and unaware. It was very pleasing. This protest lasted for a month, and for a whole month, 7 days a week from 9 a.m. until 9 p.m, junior doctors volunteered in their thousands to come from all over the country to take part in this protest. We had 2 doctors stationed there every day, and for the entirety of the protest, Jeremy Hunt was unable to use the front door of his own department because obviously he didn't actually want to ever speak to a junior doctor in public. Indeed, he still hasn't. And he had to go round the back of the department where there's apparently an underground tunnel, and he used to creep in there because we were stationed in the front. We had an enormous amount of press coverage. These policemen came up to us when we started the protest. I was very scared, being a sort of good girl who always, I never liked to be a militant activist, as I was described many times by the government. I liked to do the right thing. These policemen came up and we thought they were going to tell us off and send us on our way, and they came up and said, if anybody, and we do mean anybody, tries to tell you you can't be here, you say to them that the Metropolitan Police have said you can, you're not breaking any laws, and by the way, don't let them do to you what they've already done to the police. So that was nice. And there was a lot of press coverage of this protest. That's Channel 4 News filming us when we started it out. Ultimately, all our protesting, all our speaking out did not stop the government imposing a new contract upon us. It was deeply demoralising. It was a very distressing time, and there were no winners in this dispute, not the government, not doctors, and most of all, not patients. It was a very sorry time. Interestingly, as the whole thing drew to a close, we started to see very disturbing headlines in the press about precisely what we had argued about, understaffing and its terrible impact on patients. And I suppose the moral there is it doesn't matter how cleverly you spin and attempt to use words to inspire a story, a narrative in the minds of the voting public. In the end, words come up against reality. You can't fight that. And the reality, the winter after the dispute ended, was conditions in British hospitals that were so dreadful, so understaffed, too few doctors, too few nurses, too few beds, that the Red Cross described them as a humanitarian crisis. We had patients trapped on corridors and trolleys for 24, sometimes 48 hours at a time, and some patients literally died there. Horrendous. This winter just passed. You might think the government would have done something to address these terrible conditions. They sort of did. They used words. They sent a very strongly worded set of diktats to all the CEOs of all the hospital trusts in the country, telling them you will not treat anyone in a corridor, you will not leave any patients trapped in ambulances unable to get out into your overrun A&Es, as though somehow any hospital was choosing to do that. CEOs at this stage started speaking out as well, albeit anonymously. This is one CEO saying that the government was barking mad. And this is the president of the Royal College of Emergency Medicine, a very outspoken, wonderful leader, someone called Taj Hassan, and he said in response to these edicts that you can't flog a dead horse. This is Narnia thinking, to pretend that somehow any of this is unavoidable. I totally agree with every word he says, although in researching the images for this talk, I did find this one. It seems you can indeed flog a dead horse, but hopefully not in the NHS. I've told this story because I think it tells us something terribly important about the way in which words matter in my profession in medicine. It's an aspect of wordsmithery that is never really talked about. I never learned about it at medical school, nor in all my years of training as a junior doctor, and it's the concept of advocacy. Advocates, as we know, speak out on behalf of someone else, and we as doctors we are in a unique position to advocate on behalf of some of the most vulnerable people in society. We all know there's a socioeconomic gradient in health, and typically patients are not the people with power or voice or status or wealth in society. They are some of the most vulnerable members of our society. They may be, for example, people who are homeless or who are elderly, who have disabilities or mental health problems. My speciality has a particularly vulnerable group of people, those who are approaching the end of their life. But in general, patients are a vulnerable group, and therefore, I believe, we as doctors have a duty to speak out on behalf of our patients. We can do so much good by speaking out. We as doctors do have voice, we have training, we have education, and we have social status. We speak out and people listen. So we have all those abilities to act as advocates. Before the junior doctor dispute, we were not terribly good at speaking out. We were pretty meek and mild and obedient. We went about our jobs working very hard, living with understaffing, feeling demoralised and ground down by it, but just keeping our heads down and getting on with it. And I think we all have a lot to thank Jeremy Hunt for, because in the entire history of the NHS, no single person has ever united doctors or given them their voice or emboldened them to speak out on behalf of patients, quite like our current health secretary. So thank you, Jeremy, for giving me and all of the 54,000 junior doctors with whom I work a voice. If there's one thing I take away from the dispute, it is this. It is that the misuse of words is anathema to everything we do in medicine. We use words as a profoundly important part of building a healing, therapeutic relationship with our parents. With our patients. We use words to help people who are frightened, who are vulnerable. We use them to build trust. We explain diseases, treatments. Sometimes in palliative care, when there is no scope anymore for any drug or any treatment, there is no means of prolonging life, words can be all we have, but my goodness me, they can be powerful, because they are a way of connecting ourselves as physicians to our patients and ensuring that they know we are with them, caring for them right to the end. When words matter that much, it is, for me, a completely unacceptable travesty to have politicians misuse words for a more cynical, more ulterior motive. And I think that if the junior doctor dispute has taught us anything at all, it is that we should take a stand against that. We should advocate. So particularly for the medical students in the audience, but all of the clinicians here, I would urge you all to go forth in your practice thinking about the power, the force of the words that you have at your disposal. Be an advocate, stand up for your patients, speak out. It can be scary. You can worry about the consequences. You can be fearful of the effect on your career. All of those things are very valid, but actually, none of them come close to the vulnerability and the fear and isolation and all those other terrible things that so many of our patients can feel. So please use your training and your education and your social status and your voice and speak out, because words are everything in medicine, and I just urge you to use them wisely. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. Just a quick reminder that if any of you are tweeting, to use the hashtag dotMD18 so that people can follow the conversation who aren't here, or we can all follow it later on. And so please do that. Rachel, it sounds like a horror story when you mention figures like 100,000 missing doctors, and there's a lot of horrifying aspects to it, both on the side of medical professionals and patients. Is this something that you ever saw yourself? I mean, why did you step up? Why did you decide it? I think it started with the letter. I mean, is your journalistic background something to do with that, or is it just a case of I can't actually take this anymore?
I think fundamentally, a big part of it is the fact that temperamentally I'm someone who hates bullying. I can't bear to see people being stamped on by those above them with power and authority. And as a junior doctor who was so very old, having had a previous career that gave me so many of the skills to fight back against a government that was using spin against the medical profession, I really felt like I had no choice. I had to take a stand. During this time, I would have doctors I didn't know, house officers sometimes, who'd only been working as a doctor for 2 or 3 months, literally coming up to me in tears saying, we just can't bear what's happening, we can't stand having to read this in the press. And I don't want it to sound grandiose, but because I knew how to speak out, I wanted to, because I couldn't stand the sense that many doctors who were 10 years younger than me and had entered the medical profession so full of excitement and enthusiasm and sort of honour and humility about being doctors were now being treated in this way. We have a real problem in the UK with junior doctor suicide, and even during the dispute, a young doctor who had only been a doctor for 3 months, Rose Polge was her name, committed suicide. And in her suicide note, she talked about how appalling the understaffing was where she worked, and she cited Jeremy Hunt. If you have doctors who are literally killing themselves because their work conditions are unendurable, then there's a real problem. And I felt as though nothing was more important than speaking out about that. I didn't really care what happened to my career. It had to be said.
This also makes me think that, medicine is such a specific kind of career. It takes an awful lot of time and expense to qualify. The hours are very antisocial. It's a very, very tough career and requires huge commitment. Have you seen then that, unfortunately, have a lot of people left, have opted out and just went, I can't do this?
Yeah, and it's one of the saddest things. It is hard in those ways you've described, but medicine is also clearly the best possible career in the world. Maybe being a writer is quite good as well, but I couldn't imagine doing anything in my life that was more fulfilling and rewarding and wonderful than medicine in every conceivable way. You get to help people, you get to learn all the incredible science, you use your hands to save people's lives. It's everything, it's wonderful. And there's a tragedy in the idea that you can have young doctors who love all of those aspects of medicine, have poured their heart and soul into 6 years of medical school and then another 8 or 9 years as a junior doctor, only to find things so unendurable that they end up walking away. And we now have a situation where 1 in 10 of all junior doctor jobs in the UK are lying empty because recruitment and retention are so dire, because doctors are giving up, they're going to Australia, they're quitting the profession completely, and none of that is being addressed, sadly, by the government. It's so poignant.
When you talk about words, and we all know that, that in certain cases in medicine there will be, actual medicine, medication or surgery or other interventions required, but you firmly believe that words are a big part of how we treat patients. Why so?
Well, of course, the sort of hard nuts and bolts are vital. If your heart has stopped beating, you don't really want a poem.
A nice chat.
You want a defibrillator. But actually, I think the whole framework in which nearly all of our therapeutic interventions take place, perhaps with the exception of dealing with a cardiac arrest, is one in which you have to ensure that the patient's wishes, what matters to the patient, is centre stage. It doesn't really matter what you as the doctor think. If a patient has capacity, if they can make decisions for themselves, what they care about, what matters to them, is crucial. And you can't find that out if you don't respect them, if you don't listen to them, and if you don't use your words with care to encourage patients to talk. So a good example is in the realm of cancer treatment, where many doctors, Atul Gawande is a good example, have written so eloquently about the problems of over-treatment, of continuing to operate, to cut out the next bit, to constantly intervene. Perhaps, yes, prolonging life by doing that, but actually potentially at the expense of eroding a patient's quality of life and actually giving them a final end of their days that is just pain and hospital procedure and chemo and relentless side effects, when really what mattered to them was spending their last months in the bosom of their family. You can't unpick any of that without words, and that's why it's so important. Otherwise, interventions are being used blindly and potentially in ways that cut across what matters to patients, and that has to be centre stage of everything we do.
Myself and Murish spoke last year about the idea of empathy in medicine, and obviously there's so much to learn when you're training. That is it problematic that when somebody's expected to find it on the ward or in the consultation room, and is it something that needs to be maybe taught a bit earlier and brought up a bit earlier in a doctor's medical journey or their medical life?
Absolutely. I'm desperate for medical school to be different in this fundamental respect. At the moment, we have I think, a slightly tick-boxy approach to teaching empathy. We teach communication skills formally to medical students, and that is a good thing. I teach those skills to students, but it's very artificial, and students tend not to like it because there's nothing more hideous than role-playing, telling someone they've got cancer in front of all your peers. It's a very artificial environment. I believe, actually, the best way to instill a sense of empathy is to make patients much more of a fundamental presence in medical school. I think we need to hear from patients. That can be difficult because patients, obviously, if they have difficult, complicated diseases, it can be very hard for them to speak. They may be too unwell. There are ways around that. So, for instance, I have filmed interviews with dying patients who were only too keen and desperate to talk about that experience, the fact that they know they are dying, precisely in order to try and communicate what that is actually like to medical students. You can't empathise with something you don't understand. If you haven't experienced a bereavement, being told you have cancer, childbirth, all of those things for yourself, it's incredibly difficult to empathise with patients in that situation because you don't understand it, you don't know what it feels like. And I think by bringing patients' voices into medical education in creative ways, we could use social media, we can certainly use film to do that. That's the way you encourage people to empathise.
How do you're quite a prolific social media user, how do you manage that in terms of, obviously there's privacy elements of being a doctor, and yet you want to have your profile has enabled you to have this conversation, to get involved with the campaign with Jerry Hunt. How do you sort of balance the two of them?
Yeah, it's interesting. So I never tweet about patients for obvious reasons, and I rarely tweet when I'm at work. I might tweet if I'm having my lunch. I don't think I think it's acceptable maybe to tweet once or twice in the day, obviously not all of the time. I think that social media is incredibly powerful in medicine in all kinds of ways, both good and bad, but one of the very, very good and powerful ways is social media, for all its dangers and excesses and problems, and we're all aware of those, it is purely and strictly democratic. Anybody can tweet, anybody can have a voice. Patients whose voices are marginalised in other ways can speak out on social media. So can junior doctors. We had no voice before the doctor dispute, and to begin with, we had no voice in mainstream media either, but we harnessed social media and we spoke out in our droves on social media, and eventually that changed and pushed the mainstream media agenda. So we got out there in other ways in the public. People didn't like that at all. There were various ways to shut us down. I saw that as a great positive. I saw that as evidence of the fact that we were striking a nerve and we were actually challenging the government's attempt to monopolise the way in which the narratives unfolded in the junior doctor dispute. It was empowering, it was important, and it was democratic. And I think fundamentally, provided we don't live in a country like North Korea, if we live in a democracy, we all have a voice. It's up to us whether or not we use it. We can choose to be silent, we can choose to keep quiet, or we can choose to speak out. And actually, I believe an important part of my duty as a doctor, my essential duty to my patients, is speaking out. If government policies are causing harm writ large across the NHS, I have a duty to speak out, and social media is one way I can always do that. No one can stop me tweeting.
Well said. Speaking out in voices, what a lovely segue that I couldn't have paid you better to do to go to the Q&A. Suzanne, would you come up and join us? We might take a few minutes of questions before we have some music from Peter. So would anybody like to ask either Rachel or Suzanne a question? Stick your hand up. Somebody up here in the back. We'll just get you a microphone, I think, so everybody can hear you.
Hi, a question for Suzanne. A really wonderful talk. Thank you very much. I work in liaison psychiatry myself in a hospital with the neurological centre, so we are quite familiar with these seizures. But I suppose I just want to take issue slightly with, you said the solution maybe to change medical education and medical school, but my feeling is that actually a much more powerful way to change things is by the modelling you get from the other doctor once you qualify for a junior doctor. I think maybe just focusing too much on medical education as a panacea for everything won't work.
Yeah, I don't think there's any sort of single solution, but what I think we need to do is just legitimize, I suppose, what I want is for these diagnoses to be legitimate illnesses. And at the moment in medical school, there's sort of a diagnosis of exclusion. And that's what's so unhealthy for patients, and that's what's such a dismissal. So I think when we're in medical school, and then we bring this into clinic, is that you say, well, these are the common causes of abdominal pain, or these are the common cause of headache, and it's one of the legitimate equal diagnoses. And I do think that that needs to start in medical school, but that doesn't mean to say that I think that that's the only place that it should exist. And it's sort of what Rachel was talking about. You learn your values from, and you learn empathy from following your senior doctors and from looking at medicine in practice. So yes, I wouldn't want to say it should exclusively occur there, but I think in medical school, medical students need to be taught this is an illness like any other, and it should be treated as such.
Thank you. Anybody else? Somebody in the front row here? Oh, we'll come back to you.
Well, I was wondering, I like the idea very much of the patient with a psychosomatic paralysis to be sent to rehab, but will an insurance company pay for that? Can you cite that as a legitimate, quote-unquote, cause that will actually be funded for physical rehabilitation?
Of course, I feel very happy to work for the National Health Service, where I don't ever worry about those things. But that's the bottom line, is that we need to sort of, first of all, we need to create a body of evidence that, because at the moment these are such, this hodgepodge of disorders which haven't had enough scientific study. So, for example, if you look at dissociative seizures and you try and find studies that support the claim that CBT works, there's very little evidence. There is some evidence, but not a lot of evidence out there. But if we can create the evidence that this particular disorder is a legitimate disorder, and here's a scientific study that proves that this sort of CBT or this sort of rehab makes these people better, then presumably that can then be presented to the NHS funders or to the insurance companies. I think at the moment, because there's such a sort of a poorly researched topic, that is proving difficult. But that is aside from medical schools, we need to make this the same focus of research. We have a body of evidence to create business cases. Okay. Somebody over here.
Thanks. Great talks from both of you. Thank you very much. My sister's a journalist, so and I just find it intriguing what you were saying, coming at it from a journalistic point of view. We obviously still we were brought up in the UK, but we live back in Ireland now. And one of the things that we've really been most struck by in recent decades, particularly, is the discourse in the media in the UK. Compared with, I mean, certainly in terms of, you saw that with the headlines that you put out there, with places like Daily Mail, Daily Express. I mean, you see it now also with Brexit. And how do you feel as a journalist, former journalist, looking at that? And do you think there is any way to turn back that tide, especially given that the Leveson 2 inquiry has been cancelled?
Yeah, very, very difficult to do that. I mean, in a sense, what you're describing comes down to power, doesn't it? And if you want to maintain political power on behalf of a wealthy class, then the wealthy owners of newspapers who also align with that objective want to help you perpetuate your political power. So I see all of these issues as coming down to fundamentally the distribution of power in society. And if you are a little person, if you're an ordinary man or woman on the street, you obviously don't have anything like the force and clout of a national newspaper, but that doesn't mean you have no clout at all. So as a doctor, you can speak out about what's really happening in the NHS. As a patient, you can do the same from your own personal experience. That applies to all walks of life. We all have our voices. I think to some extent, it's easy to get angry and moan and cry on Twitter and be outraged about 16 things a day. And it almost makes you feel better being outraged, but it doesn't necessarily achieve anything. If we're outraged, if we're really outraged by something, we need to do something about it, not just tweet about it. Now, that could be as simple as writing to your Member of Parliament. If 1,000 people in a constituency wrote to one Member of Parliament about one issue, that Member of Parliament would do something about it. So I think it's easy to feel a sense of overriding helplessness in the face of Brexit discourse and the narrative of the Daily Mail, Daily Express, if that's not one you subscribe to. But don't feel helpless, don't feel demoralised, don't let anyone suppress your voice. Actually, if you're angry about it, do something, because we all can. It takes 10 minutes to write to an MP. That's, in a democracy, a small step to enacting change.
Thank you. Somebody right up the back there, last back row.
So I've kind of a comment and a question. So Rachel, I was a junior doctor in the UK during your campaign. So first of all, thank you. It made a huge impact and difference. And I saw firsthand what it did. It gave a lot of hope to a lot of junior doctors. And just how bad it was. It's hard to imagine that there's more strain on people than happens sometimes in the HSE, but I think it was a little bit worse in the NHS. And I want to just ask Suzanne then that I worked previously briefly in liaison psychiatry and have seen these functional medicine cases. And I was just kind of struck by the phrase non-organic illness. And it made me think about, say, the mind-brain spectrum, that when we separate it out and tell someone that this is in their mind and not in their brain or in their nervous system, that it was harder to conceptualize for people, that we made it something vague and grey and poorly understood by being in their mind. And whilst it's still difficult to understand, I think if you say that there is a physiological illness, that there's a problem in communication in your nervous system, I found that easier for some people to understand.
Yes, that's precise. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I mean, that's precisely right. This is not a pathological process, it's a physiological process. And you can demonstrate that there are differences in, so if you put somebody in a functional MRI machine and ask them to pretend to be paralyzed, and then you put somebody else in a functional MRI and who has a functional or psychosomatic paralysis, you will see different patterns of activation in the frontal lobes. So whatever's happening in your brain when you have a functional disorder is something physiological but not necessarily pathological. So that is part of the conversation with patients, is that it's about making them understand that for some physiological reason they're unable to recruit the motor area of their brain. That can be demonstrated on a scan, but it's very important then some people get attached to these ideas and think that means pathological, or that there's something, you can train your brain in a more positive way, but you can also train it in a negative way. And you need to understand that it's a reversible, non-pathological process. Yes, but sorry, all of these are part of the conversation. There's a limit to how much can be covered in half an hour.
We might have time for one more question. Maybe yourself?
Thanks both for really, really interesting discussions. I think there's a need for the discussion around psychosomatic illness amongst the public before they become patients. So there's much more awareness of how common, these things are, and that it allows conversations about the fact that, oh yes, quite a lot of people I know might have a similar situation. So it's not at the stage where people are patients, but it's where they're actually people.
Yes, I think that's precisely right. I mean, the problem is at every level, because I know that when I tell a patient about this problem, it's stigmatized socially. You know that if your next door neighbor, you see them in a wheelchair and you are told they have multiple sclerosis, and you find out 6 months later they actually have a psychosomatic problem, I think even the most well-meaning person sees that person differently. And that's obviously the level at which we need to change how these things are discussed. And as you say quite rightly, that's why I always emphasize, how common these physical responses to emotional things are. I mean, they're just ubiquitous. And if people can begin to appreciate that and we can approach the stigma, then the conversation between doctor and patient will obviously be much more straightforward.
Thank you. There's going to be a break soon, and I'm sure there'll be lots of time to have chats and mingling during the day. You can continue that conversation online at #dotMD18. I want to say a huge thank you to Rachel Clarke and Suzanne O'Sullivan. Both of their books, Your Life in My Hands and It's All in Your Head, will be for sale at the bookstall outside. So thank you both.